Over the past few weeks, in these Sangha Nights, we've been following a theme called Encounters with Reality, meeting the Tantric Guru. In the late form of Buddhism, it gets called Tantric Buddhism, the Tantric Guru was a sort of uncompromising teacher who brought their disciples face to face with reality. Sometimes by gentle means, but sometimes by a really uncompromising, no-holds-barred way that challenged the disciples' delusions, smashed through the veil that was separating them from reality. So meeting the Tantric Guru was an encounter with reality, which cut through the obstacles that prevented the disciple from moving towards awakening, seeing things as they are. So I said at the start of this series that we don't really do gurus in Triratna. It's a bit of a dangerous concept in the West. It's just way too open to abuse. So we don't do gurus. That's not a concept that's particularly suitable to the West. But that doesn't mean that we can't have an encounter with reality, that in a way we can't meet our equivalent of the Tantric Guru. Because reality can get through to us in many, many different ways. We've got lots of, we could say that reality is always trying to get through to us, actually, in any way that it can. We've got lots of records, for example, from the Pali Canon, from the early Buddhist texts, of how reality broke through to people, how people encountered reality in the shape of the Buddha, the historical Buddha, who was so in touch with reality that really he was reality. And all our talks so far, including the one tonight in a way, have been about that. And we will be moving on into other territories as we go further on. They've all been about an encounter with the historical Buddha and how that opens somebody's eyes up to the nature of things. But reality can also get through to us through other people. It doesn't have to be the Buddha. It doesn't just have to be the historical Buddha. Reality can come through to us through deep meditation, for example, or visionary experiences, or even dreams. And we'll be hearing about some examples of that as we go on. And reality can also break through to us just through life. Life can smash us out of our ruts, and we have to accept things as they are. So in fact, all of those ways can function as the Tantric Guru for us. And in fact, as I said, reality is trying to get through to us all the time. But we usually don't want reality to get through to us, actually. It's as though we've created a sort of nice cosy cocoon for ourselves in which we live, and that cocoon might be a bit boring. It might even get a bit smelly, actually, in that cocoon. But it seems safe, it seems familiar, and we're used to it. So we tend to prefer that very often to the clear air of reality. All that bright light, all those bright colours, those vivid colours, keep the lid on things. So we create all sorts of veils between ourselves and reality, which means between ourselves and enlightenment. But every now and then, something happens that allows reality to break through. This should be a wonderful experience, shouldn't it? It should be a wonderful experience when we come face to face with reality. Maybe we have some sort of breakthrough in meditation, or as a result of some experience, some other experience, and we're opened up to the beauty of things, the joy and wonder of reality. We're deeply connected to other beings and the universe around us, and we see that the unconditioned reality, which is sort of shining through the condition that we normally experience, we see it is awesome and wonderful and beautiful. Wouldn't that be nice? Wouldn't that be nice? But often our encounters with reality are not like that. Often we build such strong walls between ourselves and reality, around ourselves, that we cut ourselves off from any connection with the reality out there. And as long as life continues on its usual, maybe slightly boring, dull way, reality cannot get anywhere near us. And then something goes wrong. Something goes wrong which sort of breaks our old stuck self out of the patterns that it's been in. And then reality can break through. But instead of feeling like a wonderful sort of theophany or whatever, budophany, it's actually feels like a catastrophe. It feels like our life's falling apart. The walls are broken down. We don't want to be kicked out of our cocoon into a bigger life. And one of the main ways we cut ourselves off from reality so that it can only get through to us in this rather unpleasant way is by setting ourselves up on a high horse, trying to be special, trying to be superior. And what I'm going to talk about tonight is an occasion where, rather uncomfortably, reality knocked someone off their high horse, which is in the Pali Canon, so that reality could get through to them. Okay, so if you're nearly as old as me, you might remember a series on Radio 4 called Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which became a bit of a cult. And as you can guess from the title, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was a sort of comic sci-fi series, a very humorous science fiction series. And one of the characters in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was the very, very annoying galactic president Zaphod Beeblebrox. And Zaphod Beeblebrox was less like a politician or a galactic president than like a spoiled rock star. Hip and cool and completely full of himself. Despite apparently being really rather quite stupid. So Zaphod Beeblebrox was a sort of archetype, if you like, of what is popularly called ego. I mean, I don't mean ego as psychologists use the term ego, as a sort of controlling centre of the personality, or the ordered centre of the personality. I mean the popular idea of ego as the part of us that thinks we are so special. The part of us that thinks we are so important. The part of us that thinks just in terms of me. That's the part of us that makes our ears prick up when we hear our name mentioned. That always looks for our photo, our picture. If we see some pictures of an event we've been at, where am I? That loves to see our name in print. Or our picture on the programme. And we've all got, I can tell by the laughter, we've all got our inner Zaphod Beeblebrox. So as well as great characters like Zaphod Beeblebrox, the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy also had some really inventive ideas and quirky ideas. And one of these quirky ideas was called the total perspective vortex. Okay. And the total perspective vortex was a sort of machine thing that if you were put into the total perspective vortex, your perspective suddenly opened up. So that you saw things as they are. You saw yourself in context. So you saw not just the usual little bit of the world you focus on, but you saw the whole of reality. So you would see the billions of human beings on this planet. This little world. And you see this little world as just a tiny speck going around just one tiny sun. One tiny little star among billions of stars. Spread out in this vast, mind-numbing immensity of space going in all directions, beyond the imagination. And you'd see that planet existing for this tiny, short period of time, in this immensity of time stretching before and after. And in the midst of this mind-boggling immensity, you would see a tiny little sign, a tiny little arrow, pointing to this imperceptible, tiny, transient, short-lived speck, saying, "You are here." And in The Hitchhiker's Guide, the total perspective vortex was used as a punishment for major crimes. Being put into the total perspective vortex was the punishment for only the most terrible crimes, because it was a completely crushing experience. It was said that anybody who had ever experienced the total perspective vortex had gone completely mad, except for one. And that one exception was Zaphod Beeblebrox, because his ego was so huge that he was completely immune. He still thought he was the most important thing in the universe. So being put into the total perspective vortex was an encounter with reality. And for people who were not prepared for it, that encounter with reality was a shattering experience. It was shattering because we don't live in reality. We live in our ego's extremely deluded version of a very flattering, imaginary version of reality, in which an imaginary world in which me is special and uniquely important. And the more we are trapped in that delusion, the more devastating an encounter with reality will be, the more devastating it would be to be put into the total perspective vortex. So obviously the idea that Zaphod Beeblebrox would be completely immune is a joke. It's a funny series. That was a joke. Someone with an ego as big as Zaphod Beeblebrox's would have, in fact, have been even more devastated than most. The people with the biggest egos are going to be the ones that are most devastated. Or the people who think they're more special are going to be the ones that are most devastated, the worst affected by the total perspective vortex. So, total perspective vortex encounter with reality. And as I've said, an encounter with the Buddha was also an encounter with reality. Now, I should stress here that from absolutely everything we read and everything we know about the Buddha, he was always concerned above all for the well-being of the people he came into contact with, the people he met and the people he spoke to. And generally, it was not conducive to the well-being of people for the Buddha to put them into the total perspective vortex. In the words of the poet T.S. Eliot, humankind cannot stand very much reality. So the Buddha sort of tended to give reality in homeopathic doses. Most of the Buddha's teaching, in fact, doesn't focus on showing people reality so much as helping people to grow to become the larger sort of person who can actually cope with the total perspective vortex, who can cope with an encounter with reality. The sort of person who no longer is just confines their version of themselves to that one little transient being. It's about growing into the sort of person who can see reality without being shattered. So most of the people we read about who met the Buddha in the Pali Canon were anything but shattered by the experience. If they were holding on to harmful, wrong views, those views might have been challenged, but the Buddha was usually very, very gentle with folk. But it wasn't always like that. It wasn't always like that. And the encounter with reality, or the encounter with the Buddha that I'm going to talk about tonight, was a bit different. It was a bit different. In this encounter, the person meeting the Buddha was almost shattered, we could say. I'm sure he felt shattered at the time, even if we can see that he benefited from it in the end. What benefits us? What benefits us spiritually? What kicks us out of our cocoon isn't always what we want or what seems pleasant to ourselves as we are now. So I'm going to talk about how a young man called Ambata, a young Brahmin man called Ambata, came face to face with the Buddha. and how he found that not at all a comfortable, cozy experience. In fact, he found it an awesome or even a scary experience. And I'll also be asking, because the point is, what was it? What was it? Why was it like that for Ambata? Why was it like that for Ambata? And how can we make sure that our encounters with reality, that we can encounter reality in a way which is not so difficult? So our story starts with Ambata. It starts with the Buddha. It starts with the Buddha. So a Buddha and a number of his qualities go to a Brahmin village. They're camped on the outskirts of a Brahmin village in the kingdom of Kosala called Ikanankala. And they're spending their time in the forest near that village. And then on a rich estate, a very rich estate on the outskirts of Ikanankala, there lived a rich and powerful and very famous Brahmin called Pokarasadi. And this Pokarasadi had heard about the Buddha. He'd heard about the Buddha, and he'd heard the Buddha was staying nearby. He'd heard very, very favourable reports about the Buddha. So in the sutta, we hear Pokarasadi saying to himself, people are saying that this Gautama is fully awakened, abounding in wisdom and goodness, happy, unsurpassed as a guide for those who are willing to be taught a Buddha. They say that he thoroughly knows and sees this universe face to face. And having known it, he makes his knowledge known to others. He teaches the beautiful truth. He makes known the higher life in all its beauty. It would be a good thing to visit him. But actually, Pokarasadi does not go to visit the Buddha himself. Perhaps it's a bit too risky for a high Brahmin like him to go and ask advice from a lonely beggar wandering around, or perhaps, especially if he discovers that the Buddha's not the real thing. So what he does is he sends his chief disciple. He sends his chief disciple, Ambata. So he says, now then, dear Ambata, go to this wanderer Gautama and find out whether his reputation is true or not. So Ambata sets out to do what his teacher asked him. But Ambata doesn't just sort of stroll, they're not far away, but Ambata doesn't just sort of stroll along on foot, okay? Oh no, Ambata wants to go in style. So he gathers a retinue. He gathers a retinue of other young Brahmins, all gorgeously dressed on horseback. And he himself mounts a grand horsed chariot. So you can imagine him setting off with all his followers and on their horses, gorgeously dressed, and him towering above them all on his chariot. And I think this tells us a lot about Ambata, actually. So for a start, he's a sort of high-status social leader. If he goes anywhere, he can gather a retinue of other young men to go with him as his attendants, sort of a bit like a petty king travelling with his court. And secondly, while all the other young men go on horseback, which immediately puts them above everybody else, puts them above the level of the common pedestrian like the Buddha, he goes in a chariot, which puts him above even them, even above his followers. He makes himself special by placing himself, as it were, symbolically, on this grand chariot. But we've heard that the Buddha was staying in the forest. The Buddha was staying in the forest nearby, and chariots don't work very well in the forest. In fact, horses don't really work very well in the forest either. There's all these trees in the way and branches and whatnot. Paths are narrow and there's undergrowth and all that. So it isn't long before Ambata has to get down off his chariot and walk on foot. So he has to send back his chariot, his followers have to send back their horses. And I think there's something very, very symbolic about Ambata having to get down off his chariot to approach the Buddha. This sort of thing happens a lot in the Pali Canon. When someone thinks they are very special, they show this by travelling in grand style. But when they get anywhere near the Buddha, they always have to get off and walk. So when a king goes to see the Buddha, he travels with his entourage and elephants wives and concubines and armed warriors and tumblers and acrobats and musicians and whatever else, with banners and umbrellas. And as soon as he gets near the Buddha, he has to get down off his elephant, he has to send this lot home, and he has to walk on his own 2 feet and approach on his own 2 feet like the ordinary human being that he is. So Ambata's chariot and a king's procession of elephants symbolise the fact that the person who is approaching the Buddha thinks they're really special. So special that in their heart of hearts they secretly think they're better than the Buddha. And Ambata has to get down off his chariot that makes him so special, and walk like everybody else if he's going to approach the Buddha. And he doesn't like it. He doesn't like it one bit. So when Ambata and his followers are shown into the sort of makeshift hut, the shelter that the Buddha is staying in, we're told the other young Brahmins exchanged polite and courteous greetings with the Buddha and took their seats. But Ambata greeted the Buddha in an offhand way and stayed standing up, walking about and fidgeting, while the Buddha stayed seated. And the Buddha says to him, "Is this the way, Ambata, that you hold discussion with aged teachers and the teachers of your teachers, who are well advanced in years?" And Ambata replies, "Certainly not, Gautama. It is proper to speak with a Brahmin standing if he is standing, or seated if he is seated, or reclining if he is reclining. But with shaveling beggars, sham friars, menial blackfellows, who are like dirt on the feet of my noble family, with them I talk to you as I do now." He's asking for it. He's asking. This is really insulting. This is really insulting. But the Buddha is above being insulted. The Buddha is above being insulted, and he stays completely unfailingly polite. He says, "But you must have been wanting something, Ambata, when you came here. Remember why you came here, or I will think of you, this young Brahmin is ill-bred." Although he prides himself on his culture. So the sutta tells us that Ambata then was really displeased and angry with the Buddha because he feels he's been called rude by the Buddha. So he spoke to the Buddha, the sutta says, in a scoffing, jeering way, saying, "You Shakyans are a rough bunch, Gautama, rude and touchy and violent. You are a clan of low-life menials who do not honour your betters." And still the Buddha stays polite. He says, "Have the Shakyans offended you in some way, Ambata?" And Ambata replies, "Once, Gautama, I had to go to Kapilavastu on some business, and I went into the Shakyans' meeting hall. There were a number of Shakyans, old and young, seated in the hall on grand seats, making merry and joking together. And I think it was me that they were laughing at. And not one of them even offered me a seat." I think given Ambata's attitude, you can imagine the scene, can't you? You can imagine the scene. I mean, maybe he goes into the Shakyans' meeting hall feeling and acting oh so special. And maybe the Shakyans do find this stuck-up young man really funny, and maybe they do laugh at him. Maybe they think he's hilarious and they joke at his expense. I think much more likely, though, the Shakyans weren't paying him any attention. They were just there and they were laughing and joking among themselves, completely without reference to him. But Ambata thinks he's the centre of the universe. So as far as Ambata is concerned, everything refers to him. If they're laughing, they must be laughing at him. And they're on high seats. They're meeting them, after all. They're on seats, and he isn't. So he feels they're setting themselves above him. They're making themselves more special than him, and there's nothing he likes less than that. But anyway, by this time, the Buddha has got Ambata's number. And the sutta tells us that the Buddha thought, this Ambata is very set on humbling others. It would do him a favour if I were to humble him. It would do him a favour if I were to humble him. Ambata has got off his chariot in the physical sense as he approached the Buddha, but in his mind he's still on his chariot. In his mind he has not got down off his chariot. He is still firmly on his grand chariot, above everybody else, above the Buddha, completely deluded, completely cut off from reality. And he is going to carry on being laughably stupid. He's going to carry on being a fool until he gets down off his chariot and puts himself on a proper level. So the Buddha thinks it would do him a favour if I were to humble him. The Buddha is going to do him a favour. But it's not going to seem like that to Ambata. It's not going to be a favour that Ambata particularly appreciates. The Buddha is, as I said, he's unfailingly polite. But, I mean, we're talking about an enlightened man here. He is a formidable person. I imagine he had a formidable presence. You don't mess with him. So he starts off by asking Ambata a simple question. He says, what's the name of your family, Ambata? You're very proud of your family. What's the name of your family? And Ambata replies proudly, I am a Kanayana. And the Buddha's got him. He has seen that Ambata's sense of his superiority, his social superiority, is based on a lie because he knows something about this family. So he says, in which case, if we were to follow up your ancient name and lineage, Ambata, it would appear that the Shakyans were once your masters and that you are the offspring of one of their slave girls. And the Buddha says, isn't that true, Ambata? Isn't that the origin of your family? Isn't your family descended from a slave girl? And Ambata just sits there and refuses to answer. So the Buddha asks the question a second time. Is it true, Ambata? Isn't it true that your family were once servants among the Shakyans and that one of your ancestors was a Shakyan slave girl? Again, Ambata sits completely silent. He's not going to say anything. So the Buddha asks the question a third time. Isn't it true, Ambata? Isn't it true that your ancestors were once servants of the Shakyans and that you're descended from a Shakyan slave girl? And again, Ambata refuses to answer. And at this point in the story, something rather shocking happens. Something rather surprising. The Buddha says, I warn you, Ambata, if you do not answer, if you try to change the subject, or if you try to leave without answering me, your head will be split into 3 pieces. Is what I said true? And suddenly Ambata sees the terrifying figure of Vajrapani towering over him with a huge Vajra in his hand, surrounded by flames, fiery, dazzling, full of energy and determination, ready to split Ambata's head into 3 pieces with his Vajra, the ultimate weapon, the diamond thunderbolt. Only the Buddha and Ambata can see this terrifying figure. And Ambata is terrified. He cowers at the Buddha's side, in awe, clutches at the Buddha robes, begs, protect me, save me, Buddha, save me. Okay. So some of us will be familiar with this figure of Vajrapani, or Vajrapani as it's more usually called. But if you've never come across him, you might be asking yourself what on earth that is all about. Just briefly say that Vajrapani is a figure who crops up several times in the Pali Canon. He's quite a big figure in later Buddhism, but he crops up in the Pali Canon, the earliest Buddhist scriptures, as a sort of protector of the Buddha, a guardian of the Buddha. So the myth goes that he was what's called a yaksha. And a yaksha is a sort of nature spirit, bristling with fearsome warrior energy. It's like a demonic nature spirit. But that he heard the Buddha teaching the Dharma and was enthralled and was converted to the Dharma. So he puts all that energy, all that fierce warrior energy at the service of the Dharma by appointing himself as the Buddha's protector and guardian. So if you mess with the Buddha, you mess with Vajrapani. In later Buddhism, Vajrapani becomes quite a major figure in his own right, who represents the, if you like, the awesome strength and energy, the fearsome power of the enlightened mind. He represents the aspect of the enlightened mind that smashes through delusion, that breaks through barriers to get to reality, to get to awakening. Smashes anything that stands between us and enlightenment. And he's portrayed as this rather terrifying blue figure, built like very big. Surrounded in flames, the epitome of energy. So we could say that what Vajrapani really represents in this mythic way is, if you like, is the sort of awesome aspect of the Buddha, the awesome aspect of reality, or the aspect of reality that seems terrifying to us, as long as metaphorically we're still on our high horse, as long as metaphorically we still pretend to be up on our chariot, above other people, above the Buddha. Vajrapani is the way reality looks if you look into the total perspective vortex while you're still on your chariot. So the Buddha says, you better answer me now, Ambata, or your head will split into pieces. Is it not the case that your ancestor was a servant god of the Shakyans? And Ambata, so he sees this enormous, terrifying figure of Vajrapani towering above him, surrounded by flames, crackling with energy, with a huge Vajra in his hand, and he cowers down by the Buddha's side and begs for protection. And he cries out in fear. It is just as the Venerable Gautama says, that is the origin of the Kamayanas. And at that point, all the young Brahmins who'd come with him roll around laughing. Only the Buddha and Ambata can see Vajrapani, so they all roll around laughing, saying, Ambata, who is so high and mighty, is descended from a slave girl, ha ha. And the family is so proud of her, once servants of the Shakyans. But the sutta goes on to say that the Buddha then rebuked them and said, do not disparage Ambata on the grounds of his descent. In the supreme perfection of wisdom, there is no place for pride or status. Whoever is in bondage to pride or status, they are far from wisdom. It is only by having got rid of all that bondage to pride and status that you can realise the supreme perfection of wisdom. So that's what happened. That's the story of what happened when Ambata came face to face with reality in the form of the Buddha. So to finish the talk, to round off the talk, I'd like to unpack a little the meaning of that encounter by exploring, well, first of all, why was it, well, I suppose we know already, why was it that the encounter was so difficult for Ambata? And what can we do in our practice to make sure that our encounters with reality are not like that? Why is it relevant to us? So, pretty obviously, Ambata had such a hard time when he comes face to face with the Buddha because he did not really leave his chariot behind when he was going through the forest. When he approached the Buddha, he was still on his chariot. He was still trying to be special, above others, above even the Buddha. He had constructed an image of himself that made him special, the image of this really high status family. And that image of himself was based on a lie, based on ignoring the reality of who he really was, based on spinning the truth. In Ambata's case, the self-image that made him special was based on the social status of his family. And he hid from the reality, which was that he was descended from slaves. But like Ambata, we might not be as obviously stupid as him, but like Ambata, we've all got an image of ourselves that we present to the world, and that we get to believe in ourselves, actually. We've all got that chariot that we put ourselves up on. Or changing our metaphor, we build a sort of rickety pedestal for ourselves. A rickety pedestal of self-image based on very unreliable foundations that won't stand too much rocking or pushing, a pedestal that allows us to feel special and in some way superior. So for us, it's very, very unlikely that we try and feel superior on the basis of our family status, like him. But it might be based on all sorts of other things. For example, our success in some field of worldly activity. When I first came along to the Dharma, I was successful academically and reasonably successful in a worldly, professional way. And because of that, I felt quite justified in thinking that I often knew better than the Dharma and knew better than the people in the Sangha I was coming across. I could pick bits of the Dharma that I agreed with because I was so clever and ignore the bits that I disagreed with. And I was too clever to accept I could ignore the inconvenient challenges that I got from the Sangha because I was cleverer than those people. I was so clever and successful and they weren't. I knew best. I could do it on my own. Every time I went on an ordination retreat and was put in a group, I used to think, they've put me in with the duffers. For at least the first few days. I mean, after a while, I sort of realised that was not true. So I put myself on a pedestal above the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha, based on my worldly success and my supposed brilliant intelligence. Although all this cleverness had not created a happy life for me, which was why I was looking for one in the Dharma. Like Ambata's pride in his family, my pedestal was not based on reality. It was based on the spin of the truth. And in our different ways, I think we all make ourselves a pedestal that makes ourselves special. Bits of the pedestal might include the type of music we listen to even, or the books that we've read that make us superior to the music we listen to that makes us superior to people who listen to a different sort, or the books we've read, or the films we like, or the newspapers we read, or the sort of clothes we wear, or the sort of people we hang out with, our opinions. We're not likely to pride ourselves on being upper class like Ambata. We might pride ourselves on being working class instead. That might be part of our pedestal, what makes us special. Our sexual inclinations might make us special. Even negative things can make us special. My unique victimhood makes me special. I am uniquely victimised by the world. I am uniquely flawed. Our unique suffering, our unique weakness, our psychological complexity that makes us and before we come face to face with the Buddha, before we come face to face with reality, if we don't want that to be a shattering experience, we need to get down off that rickety pedestal. Leave our chariot behind. So how do we do this? How do we practice so that we're getting down off our pedestal? How do we practice in the Dharma in a way that helps us to get down off our chariot? Well, I'm going to make 4 suggestions. The first one is to practice the 4th precept as strongly as we can. Really pay attention to the 4th precept, which is truthful speech. So we hear when we do introductory classes that truthful speech doesn't just mean not telling whoppers, not telling porky pies. It means not carrying on the sort of spin about ourselves that we usually do, sort of slightly changing reality all the time so that we look good, so that we're in the right, so that no blame attaches to us, so that we're really interesting. Maybe it's the opposite, maybe it's so that we're really victimised or whatever, but that sort of spin that we engage in to create our image. If we really pay attention to our speech and notice, I was just about to exaggerate, I was just about to play down, I was just about to give my side of the story and not theirs, this will help us to get down off our pedestal, because we will start to see, which Ambata could not, that we're basing our version of ourselves on a delusion. If Ambata had told the truth, he would never have been on the pedestal in the first place. So practice the 4th precept. It's actually a really challenging precept to practice because it brings us up against our ego all the time, our desire to look good, to not be blamed, to all the other things that we try to do, to get what we want. So practicing the 4th precept is a really powerful practice. So that's the first one. The second one I would suggest is engage as much as we can with the Sangha, and particularly cultivate the sort of spiritual friendship in which we can be transparent and open. We need to take off our masks, get down off our chariots, the same thing, and we need a context in which it's safe to take off our masks. And the Sangha gives us that. So we all have our equivalent of the fact that Ambata's family was descended from slaves. We all have the things about ourselves that we don't talk about. They're sort of behind, you know, we've got a mask. We need a context in which it is safe and encouraged for us to talk about ourselves in the round, as we really are. To be open and transparent about ourselves, our faults and our weaknesses as well as our strengths. And for me, to be honest, this has been one of the main benefits I've had from my experience of Triratna. And I think it's the same for a lot of people. If you get more involved with Triratna, more embedded in the Sangha, you'll find that this is an important practice for us. This is seen as a really important practice. To have situations, to have friends in which we really reveal ourselves as we are. We talk about ourselves as we are. I remember the first time I told my life story in a Triratna context. I was living in a men's community at the time. We were very, very close together because we were doing something together. We were on a project together. And we were telling our life stories. And I told my life story, warts and all. And I realised I was telling these guys things I had never told anybody. I'd been married and I hadn't told them to my wife. I certainly wouldn't tell them to my parents, for example. You know, I was talking about myself as it really was. And this was just completely liberating. It was just completely liberating. I was free to be myself. I didn't have to have the mask anymore. I was free to come out from behind the mask, and whole continents of anxiety about myself, I think, fell away. Now, okay, that's just one occasion. It's a more gradual process. But I think this, the process of learning to be ourselves rather than the mask, to be ourselves rather than the sort of figure standing on the what do they call it? The pinnacle that we've created, the sort of rickety structure that we've created, I think is one of the main things we can get out of our experience of the spiritual life. For maybe more important than meditation, actually, because if you can meditate up a storm, but if you're not real about yourselves, if we're not real about ourselves, we're not going anywhere. So that's my second one: is really engage with the Sangha. You know, seek ways to really engage with the Sangha and to put yourself in situations where it's possible to be open and transparent. That's very much the ideal for order chapters, for chapters of order members, is that we are just completely transparent to each other. No secrets whatsoever. Telling it like it is. So the third thing I'd say is seek to be open and receptive. To move towards reality, we need to get off our high horse as we approach the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha. Ambata had to get off his chariot as he approached the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha. We have to get off our high horse as we approach the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha. And I think that what that might mean is, for example, when we come across the Dharma and it doesn't always completely sync with our opinions, we might at least be open to the fact that it might be the Dharma that's right and our opinions that are wrong. Or when we come across people who've practiced a lot more than we have, we might just be open to the idea that those people have more experience of the spiritual life and may actually have a broader vision than we do about the nature of things. Not slavishly doing what they say, but at least be open to that idea and willing to really give serious consideration to what they say. So that would be my third one, to be open and receptive. There's a story, isn't there, in the, I think it's the Japanese canon, about this professor who goes to visit a monk, an abbot, and they get in conversation, and the abbot is pouring tea, and he pours the professor's tea, and he just keeps pouring and pouring and pouring, and the tea goes everywhere. And the professor says, "Why are you doing this? Why are you doing this?" And he says, "Well, it's just like you're already full. So I don't know why you've come to see me, because there's no room for anything else." In a sense, we have to be a bit empty. We have to be at least a little bit, we have to empty our cup a bit before the Dharma and the Sangha can put anything in. So that would be my third suggestion. And the fourth one would be avoid at all costs making the Dharma another way of being special. Another way of setting ourselves up on a different sort of high horse. I'm very spiritual. We had a cracking little sketch on that in the pantomime on Friday with Kate and Janet trying to be better Buddhists than each other, which was absolutely hilarious. Trying to be special by our practice of the Dharma. There's a real danger of that, I think, in the spiritual life. We start to get somewhere, we start to think we're a bit special. We start to think we're a bit better than other people. And that's just another way of being special. We immediately become less special when we think that. Because of that danger, we in Triratna consider it very, very unwise and actually very, very spiritual bad manners for anyone to talk publicly about any spiritual attainments. Because that all too easily becomes a way of being special. And in fact, what it's doing is making us less enlightened, not more, if we use the Dharma to set ourselves up. So we have to avoid using the Dharma to set ourselves up on a different sort of pedestal. And how can we do that? Well, I think one of the things we need to do is to avoid seeing our practice as just about ourselves, just about me and my meditation, just about me and my spiritual progress, just about me and my insights. They all become badges that we stick on ourselves, that puff us up. I think it's much safer to think of our practice in terms of a much wider context. Instead of thinking it's all about me and my progress, it's about us and our progress. Thinking much more in terms of the Sangha, actually. Thinking much more in terms of others. Seeing becoming enlightened not as a badge or more enlightened, not as a badge that we wear, but seeking to become more developed, to cultivate positive qualities in order to be more use, in order to be more use to others, in order to have better relationships, in order to have a more positive effect on the world, to make a better contribution. I think if we practice that way, we avoid the danger. We avoid the danger, to a large extent, of using the Dharma as a way of making ourselves special. And I think there really is a risk of this in the West, because there's a sort of version of the Dharma in the West that does become all about me. We practice it on our own, it's all about my meditation, very, very big emphasis on me and my insights. But real insight actually connects us to others and makes us much more about others. So I think we should start our practice on that basis, not try and rescue it at some later stage from being all about being special. So those would be my 4 suggestions about how we can get off our chariot as we approach Buddha, Dharma and Sangha, as Ambata failed to do when he approached the Buddha, Dharma and the Sangha. That we should really pay attention to truthful speech, and particularly the aspect of truthful speech that's around all that exaggeration and spin around creating our image, the image of ourselves. Secondly, that we should really try to cultivate the sort of friendships in which we can be open and transparent. And I think it's going to be we've got a very good context for doing that, so I think that does involve involving ourselves in this context as deeply as we can, because that will give us situations in which we can do that, in which we can be open and transparent, and that automatically means we have to get off our high horse. Thirdly, what else? So be open and receptive to the Dharma and to the Sangha. And fourthly, don't use the Dharma as a way of being special, because that's a bit of a nightmare. Yes.